Ambassador Zektheri had seen many things in his 3 centuries of diplomatic service across the Galactic Council. He had witnessed the crystalline cities of Vextar Prime dissolve into singing dust during their ritual celebrations. He had observed the gas-form ethereals perform their impossible dances through the void of space itself. He had even been present when the ancient precursor vault on Kepler 442b had finally opened after 10,000 years of silence. But nothing had prepared him for the sight before him now. The human military convoy stretched across the crystalline plains of Nexus Station like a dark river of purpose and barely contained violence. From his position on the observation deck of the diplomatic quarters, Zektheri could see the endless columns of what the humans called soldiers, moving with a precision that seemed almost mechanical, yet possessed an organic fluidity that no machine could replicate. Fascinating, are they not? The voice belonged to Admiral Korath, the Valerian military attaché who had been assigned to observe the human forces. His 4 eyes tracked the movement below with the calculating gaze of a predator studying potential prey. Such small creatures, yet the entire galaxy trembles at the mention of their approach. Zektheri's tentacles writhed slightly, a sign of nervousness among his people. I confess, I do not understand the fear. They appear to be ordinary bipedal mammals. Their technology, while advanced, does not exceed our own. Their numbers are relatively small compared to the great armies of the hegemony or the Confederation fleets. Admiral Korath's laugh was like the grinding of stone against metal. Ah, my diplomatic friend, you think like one who has never faced them in battle. Would you care to hear a story? The next Syrian ambassador gestured for him to continue, his attention split between the conversation and the mesmerizing sight of the human formations below. There was something unsettling about the way they moved, something that triggered ancient instincts buried deep in his species' genetic memory. It was during the Proxima Rebellion, perhaps 50 years ago, Admiral Korath began, his voice taking on the cadence of one recounting a tale told many times before. The mining colonies had declared independence from the Centauran Empire, and the Emperor had dispatched his finest legions to bring them back into compliance. 12 million troops, supported by the most advanced war machines in known space. Zektheri nodded. He remembered the conflict, though he had been a junior attaché at the time, far from the centers of power where such decisions were made. The rebellion should have been crushed within days. The colonists had perhaps 100,000 fighters, poorly equipped and with no formal military training. But they had one thing the Emperor had not anticipated. Admiral Korath paused dramatically. They had hired human mercenaries. Surely not many, Zektheri interjected. Humans were barely known beyond their own small cluster of systems at that time. 3,000, Admiral Korath said simply. 3,000 humans against 12 million of the Empire's finest. The number seemed absurd. Zektheri was about to voice his skepticism when Admiral Korath continued. I was there, commanding a battle group of heavy cruisers in orbit above Proxima C. We watched through our sensors as the Empire forces made landfall, confident in their overwhelming superiority. The initial reports were exactly as expected. The colonist forces were being systematically eliminated, falling back toward their primary settlements. Victory seemed assured. Below them, a group of human officers was conducting what appeared to be a briefing. Even at this distance, Zektheri could see the intensity in their postures, the way they gestured and pointed at holographic displays with sharp, economical movements. Then, the humans struck, Admiral Korath said, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. We first noticed something was wrong when entire Imperial battalions simply stopped reporting. Not destroyed, mind you. They simply fell silent. When reconnaissance units were sent to investigate, they found scenes that still haunt my dreams. Zektheri's tentacles had gone very still. What did they find? Equipment abandoned, but undamaged. Weapons scattered as if dropped in panic. And bodies. Admiral Korath's 4 eyes had taken on a distant look. The Imperial soldiers had not been killed by energy weapons or explosives. They had been killed by hand, by blade, by methods so primitive that our forensics teams initially assumed we were looking at some sort of ritual sacrifice. But how is that possible? Imperial troops wear powered armor, carry plasma rifles, have personal shields. Indeed, all of which were present at these sites, mostly undamaged. The humans had somehow gotten close enough to kill trained soldiers despite every technological advantage the Empire possessed. But that was only the beginning. A commotion below caught Zektheri's attention. One of the human formations had paused, and he could see soldiers in different uniforms approaching. Even from this height, he could sense tension in the gathering. The Empire's response was swift and brutal. Admiral Korath continued. Orbital bombardment of suspected human positions. Deployment of hunter-killer drones. Chemical weapons that would have sterilized entire continents. The humans seemed to simply vanish, melting away like morning mist. They retreated? We thought so. For 3 days, there were no human sightings, no attacks. The Empire forces regrouped and began their final push toward the capital city. That was when we learned what the humans had really been doing during those 3 days of silence. Admiral Korath was silent for so long that Zektheri began to wonder if he intended to finish the story. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that seemed to press down on the observation deck like a physical force. They had been learning. Every engagement, every encounter, every moment of contact with Imperial forces had been a lesson. The humans had been studying their enemy with the dedication of scholars and the patience of apex predators. And when they finally revealed themselves again, they had become something else entirely. Below, the commotion seemed to be resolving. The different groups of humans were separating, but Zektheri noticed that their movements had taken on a new quality of alertness. Whatever had been discussed had changed something fundamental about their demeanor. The capital city of New Sardis was protected by the most advanced defensive systems in the Empire, Admiral Korath said. Energy barriers that could stop capital ship weapons. Automated defense towers that could track and eliminate targets moving at supersonic speeds. Sensor networks that could detect the heartbeat of a mouse at 10 kilometers. Impregnable, Zektheri murmured. So we believed the humans penetrated those defenses in a single night without triggering a single alarm. We know this because the city surveillance systems recorded everything that happened next. Admiral Korath activated a small holographic projector, and suddenly they were looking down at what appeared to be an empty city street. The timestamp showed it was deep in the local night cycle. Watch the shadows, Admiral Korath said softly. At first, Zektheri saw nothing. Then, almost imperceptibly, one of the shadows moved. Then another. Shapes that he had taken for architectural features or decorative elements suddenly revealed themselves to be human forms, so perfectly camouflaged that his eyes struggled to track them even when he knew where to look. How many, he whispered. We counted at least 50 in this single street. Multiply that by every street, every building, every inch of the city. The humans had turned New Sardis itself into a weapon, and they were its cutting edge. The hologram shifted to show the interior of what was clearly a military command center. Imperial officers in their distinctive blue uniforms sat at control stations, monitoring displays that showed the peaceful city beyond. None of them noticed the human figure that dropped from the ceiling vent directly behind them. What followed was so swift that Zektheri almost missed it. One moment, the command center was fully operational. The next, every Imperial officer was unconscious or dead, and the human was already moving toward the primary control console. They did not simply infiltrate military installations, Admiral Korath said as the hologram continued to show similar scenes throughout the city. They captured them intact. Every defense system, every weapon, every strategic resource fell into their hands without a single shot being fired. But surely the Empire had contingency plans. Of course, emergency protocols called for orbital bombardment of the entire city if it fell to enemy forces. The order was given. Admiral Korath's expression grew even more grim. That was when we discovered that the humans had also infiltrated our orbital platforms. The hologram now showed the interior of an Imperial battle cruiser. Zektheri could see the bridge crew frantically working at their stations, but their commands seemed to have no effect. Weapons that should have reduced the city to glass and ash simply refused to fire. 12 hours, Admiral Korath said quietly. That was how long it took the humans to completely neutralize an army that had been 3,000 years in the building. Not through superior numbers or advanced technology, but through something far more terrifying, which was understanding. The humans had taken the time to truly comprehend their enemy. Not just their weapons and tactics, but their psychology, their culture, their way of thinking. They had learned to predict Imperial responses with such accuracy that they could stay 3 steps ahead of every countermeasure. Zekthari found himself looking at the human formations below with new eyes. What he had taken for simple military organization now seemed like something far more complex and dangerous. Each group moved with the confidence of those who knew exactly what they were doing and why. But surely this was an exceptional case, he said, though even as he spoke the words, he knew he was grasping for reassurance. A single battle against an overconfident enemy. Admiral Koratha's laugh was entirely without humor. My dear diplomat, that was merely the beginning. What I have told you represents perhaps the first hour of a campaign that lasted 6 months. By the time it was over, the entire Centauran Empire had been reduced to a collection of refugee camps begging for humanitarian aid. Impossible. The Empire controlled nearly 1,000 systems. Indeed, and the humans took them all, not through conquest in any traditional sense, but through a form of warfare that none of us had ever encountered before. They did not simply defeat armies. They convinced entire populations that resistance was futile while simultaneously demonstrating that cooperation would be rewarded. The hologram had changed again, now showing what appeared to be a negotiation session. Imperial officials sat across from human representatives, and, even without sound, Zekthari could see that the power dynamic was completely one-sided. They offered terms that were more generous than anything the Empire had ever provided to its own citizens, Admiral Korath explained. Freedom of movement between systems, representation in government, economic opportunities that had been denied for centuries. But the offer came with a demonstration of what would happen to those who refused, which was nothing, absolutely nothing. The humans simply withdrew from systems that rejected their terms, leaving them to fend for themselves. But they also ensured that no aid or trade would come from the systems that had accepted the new order. Within weeks, the holdout systems were facing shortages of everything from food to fuel to medical supplies. Zekthari was beginning to understand. Siege warfare on a galactic scale. More than that, they had created a situation where resistance became genuinely disadvantageous for everyone involved, not just the resistors. Citizens in holdout systems could see for themselves that their neighbors were prospering under human administration while they suffered under the old imperial system. The implications were staggering. Traditional warfare was about defeating an enemy's military forces. What Admiral Korath was describing was something far more sophisticated and, in many ways, more terrifying. How many humans were involved in this campaign? Zekthari asked. At its peak, perhaps 50,000, against a population of nearly 200 billion. The numbers were so absurd that Zekthari's mind initially rejected them. But the evidence was there in Admiral Korath's testimony, in the historical records, in the fact that the Centauran Empire no longer existed as anything more than a footnote in galactic history. This is why the galaxy fears them, Admiral Korath said, gesturing toward the human formations below. Not because they are particularly strong or fast or numerous, but because they possess something that the rest of us have never truly developed, the ability to understand their enemies better than those enemies understand themselves. As if summoned by their conversation, a new group appeared on the plains below. These humans moved differently from the regular soldiers, with a fluidity that seemed almost predatory. They wore no distinctive uniforms, carried no visible weapons, yet something about them made Zekthari's skin crawl with instinctive fear. Who are they? He whispered. Admiral Korath was quiet for a long moment, his 4 eyes tracking the new arrivals with obvious unease. Those, my friend, are what the humans call their Special Operations Forces. If the regular human military is a precision instrument, these creatures are something else entirely. Surely they cannot be so different from their comrades. Cannot they? Let me tell you about the Helix Nebula incident. Zekthari was not sure he wanted to hear another story, but his diplomatic training compelled him to listen. Knowledge, even uncomfortable knowledge, was the currency of his profession. 3 years ago, the Synthetic Collective captured a human research station in the Helix Nebula. 2,000 civilians, including families with children. The Collective's demands were simple. They wanted access to human genetic templates for their biosynthesis programs. The Synthetic Collective was one of the galaxy's most feared civilizations, a race of artificial beings that had long ago transcended the need for organic bodies. Their technology was beyond anything most species could comprehend, and their approach to warfare was utterly ruthless. The human response was unusual, Admiral Korath continued. Instead of sending a battle fleet or beginning negotiations, they dispatched exactly 12 of these special operations soldiers. Zektheri looked down at the figures below. Even allowing for distance, he could see that they were not particularly large or imposing. Several appeared to be quite young, barely more than juveniles by galactic standards. 12 soldiers against the entire synthetic collective presence in the nebula. The collective had fortified the research station with their most advanced defensive systems. Adaptive energy shields, quantum encrypted security networks, automated defense platforms that could react to threats at the speed of light. They also held the civilians as leverage, making any direct assault impossible. Admiral Korath paused, as if gathering his thoughts for what came next. The human special forces did not assault the station. They did not attempt to disable the defenses or negotiate for the hostages. Instead, they simply disappeared into the nebula itself. Disappeared. For 6 weeks, there was no sign of them. The collective began to believe that the humans had abandoned the civilians, that their vaunted dedication to protecting their own was nothing more than propaganda. They started to make plans for proceeding with their genetic harvesting programs. The hologram flickered to life again, showing what appeared to be the interior of a synthetic collective command vessel. The artificial beings moved with mechanical precision, their crystalline forms gleaming under the ship's cold lighting. This recording was recovered from the collective's own systems, Admiral Korath said. Watch what happens next. At first, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. The synthetic beings continued their work, processing data streams, and managing their various operations. Then, without warning, one of them simply stopped moving. Equipment malfunction? Zektheri suggested. That was the initial assumption. But watch more carefully. As Zektheri watched, more of the artificial beings began to exhibit strange behavior. Some froze in place. Others began moving in erratic patterns. A few started to emit distress signals that seemed to have no apparent cause. The humans had infiltrated their information networks, Admiral Korath explained. Not through any conventional hacking or electronic warfare, but by introducing concepts that the synthetic minds could not properly process. I do not understand. The collective operates on pure logic, perfect mathematical precision. Their thought processes are entirely predictable because they follow optimal solution paths for every situation. The humans had somehow crafted information viruses that contained logical paradoxes so subtle that they did not trigger the collective security protocols, but so profound that they caused cascading failures in their reasoning matrices. The hologram now showed multiple collective vessels, and the same pattern was repeating across all of them. The artificial beings were beginning to shut down or behave in increasingly erratic ways. Within 72 hours, the entire collective presence in the nebula had been reduced to non-functional status, Admiral Korath said. Their ships were still operational, their weapons still functional, but the minds that controlled them had been compromised. And the hostages? Released unharmed. The humans walked into the research station and simply escorted the civilians to safety. The collective forces were powerless to stop them because they could no longer form coherent thoughts about the situation. Zektheri felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature in the observation deck. How is such a thing possible? That is what makes the humans so terrifying, Admiral Korath said. They do not simply fight their enemies. They study them until they understand them better than those enemies understand themselves. Then, they use that understanding to turn the enemy's greatest strengths into their greatest weaknesses. Below, the special operations humans had begun to disperse, melting away into the larger formations with the same fluid grace that had marked their arrival. Watching them go, Zektheri found himself wondering what those 12 soldiers had done during those 6 weeks in the nebula, how they had found a way to craft weapons made of pure thought. This is why the galaxy dreads them, Admiral Korath said softly. Not because they're monsters, but because there's something perhaps more dangerous. They're students of warfare who never stop learning, never stop adapting, never stop finding new ways to achieve victory through understanding rather than force. As the day wore on, and more human formations continued to arrive at Nexus Station, Zektheri began to see patterns that he had missed before. The way different units moved in relation to each other suggested a level of coordination that went far beyond simple military discipline. The humans seemed to anticipate each other's actions with an almost supernatural precision. How many wars have they fought? He asked. That depends on how you define war, Admiral Korath replied. By their own records, they have been in a state of continuous conflict for their entire recorded history. But most of those conflicts were internal, fought against members of their own species. Internal warfare? That seems primitive. Does it consider this? What better way to develop an understanding of strategy, tactics, and psychology than by fighting against beings who think exactly as you do? The humans have spent thousands of years learning to defeat themselves. Is it any wonder that they find defeating aliens so much easier? The observation struck Zektheri as profoundly disturbing. Most civilized species moved beyond internal warfare once they achieved interstellar travel. The fact that humans had continued to fight among themselves suggested a level of aggression that was deeply unsettling. But surely they have evolved beyond such behavior now that they face external threats? Admiral Korth's expression suggested that Zektheri had missed something important. My friend, the humans still fight among themselves. Even now, as they prepare to march to war against the draconian hegemony, there are human factions engaged in active conflict on dozens of worlds. Then, how can they possibly coordinate a unified military campaign? Because they have learned to disagree about everything except the threat posed by external enemies. When faced with a non-human opponent, all human conflicts become secondary concerns. They set aside their differences with a speed and completeness that defies understanding. As if to illustrate the point, a new group of humans appeared on the plains below. These wore different uniforms and carried different equipment from the forces that had arrived earlier. Yet, as Zektheri watched, they began to integrate seamlessly with the existing formations. Those are mercenaries from the outer colonies, Admiral Korth observed. 3 months ago, they were engaged in active warfare against the Terran Federation forces you see down there. Today, they fight as brothers. How can such unity of purpose coexist with ongoing conflict? That is the question that keeps military strategists across the galaxy awake at night, Admiral Korth said. The humans seem to possess an ability to compartmentalize their conflicts in ways that allow them to maintain peak effectiveness against external threats while simultaneously pursuing internal disagreements. The sun was beginning to set over Nexus Station, casting long shadows across the plains where the human forces continued to arrive and organize. Zektheri estimated that there were now nearly 1 million soldiers visible from their vantage point, with more arriving every hour. How many are expected? He asked. The final count will be approximately 10 million, Admiral Korth replied, representing every major human faction, colonial government, and military organization. The numbers were staggering. 10 million soldiers represented a significant portion of the entire human population, yet they were being deployed as if they were a single coordinated force. And they will all follow the same command structure? In theory, yes. In practice, they will operate more like a confederation of independent forces that happen to share common objectives. Each group will retain its own command hierarchy and tactical preferences, but they will coordinate their efforts through a complex system of liaisons and joint planning committees. It sounded impossibly complex, yet as Zektheri watched the forces below, he could see evidence of the coordination Admiral Korth described. Different units moved in patterns that suggested they were responding to some overarching plan, even though they clearly maintained their distinct identities and operational methods. The draconian hegemony possesses superior numbers and technology, Admiral Korth said quietly. Their war fleets could glass entire solar systems, and their ground forces are equipped with weapons that can level mountains. By every rational calculation, this human expedition should be nothing more than an elaborate suicide mission. But you do not believe it will be? Admiral Korth was quiet for a long moment, his 4 eyes fixed on the human formations below. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that suggested he was sharing a truth that cost him something to acknowledge. I have seen what they can accomplish when they truly understand their enemy, and I fear that they have been studying the hegemony for a very long time. As darkness fell over Nexus Station, the human encampments below began to glow with the soft light of portable installations. The soldiers moved through their evening routines with the same precise efficiency they had displayed throughout the day. But now Zektheri could see something else in their movements. They were confident, not with the bravado of untested warriors or the false cheer of those trying to hide their fear, but with the quiet assurance of professionals who knew their capabilities and trusted in their preparations. It was the confidence of those who had done this before and succeeded. Tomorrow they depart for the front lines, Admiral Korath said. The hegemony expects them to arrive in approximately 6 weeks, given the distance involved and the logistics of moving such a large force. And will they? Admiral Korath's laugh was entirely without humor. The humans stopped moving in predictable patterns centuries ago. The hegemony is preparing for a conventional invasion, expecting the humans to establish forward bases, secure supply lines, and advance through contested space in the traditional manner. But they will not. Would you, if you had learned to turn your enemies' expectations against them? The hegemony has spent months preparing defenses based on their understanding of how the last war was fought. But the humans have never fought the same war twice. As Zekthari prepared to leave the observation deck, he found himself taking one last look at the human encampments below. Somewhere among those millions of soldiers were the strategists and planners who would determine the course of the coming conflict. Somewhere among them were the Special Forces operatives who would find ways to achieve impossible objectives through impossible means. And somewhere among them were ordinary soldiers who would march to war not because they loved violence, but because they understood something that the rest of the galaxy was only beginning to grasp, that the price of survival in a hostile universe was eternal vigilance and the willingness to become more dangerous than any threat they might face. Thank you for the education, Zekthari said as they prepared to leave. Admiral Korath nodded grimly. Remember what you have learned here today. When the reports begin to come in from the front lines, when the impossible starts to seem routine, remember that you have seen the humans prepare for war. And understand that what you have witnessed is not the exception, but the rule. As they walked away from the observation deck, Zekthari could still hear the sounds of the human encampments below. Voices calling orders, equipment being moved and organized, the steady rhythm of a massive military force preparing for deployment. It sounded like any other army getting ready for war. But now he knew better. Now he understood why the galaxy held its breath whenever humans marched to war. It was not because they were invincible or possessed some supernatural advantage. It was because they had transformed warfare itself into a science, and they pursued that science with the dedication of scholars and the ruthlessness of apex predators. The draconian hegemony had ruled the outer spiral for 3,000 years, had crushed dozens of rebellions, and absorbed hundreds of species into their empire. They possessed technology that bordered on the magical and military traditions that stretched back to the dawn of galactic civilization. But they had never faced an enemy that learned from every encounter, adapted to every challenge, and refused to accept that any victory was impossible. They had never faced the humans. Captain Tichwesisura of the Draconian Intelligence Division stood before the tactical display in the command center of Fortress Prime, watching as red icons representing human fleet movements updated in real time across the holographic star map. The humans had been advancing through contested space for exactly 43 days, and every single one of their moves had been precisely what the hegemony strategic computers had predicted. This was troubling. Admiral Vexthal, she said, turning toward the massive form of the sector commander. The old Draconian's scaled hide bore the ritual scars of 100 battles, and his 6 arms moved with practiced efficiency as he coordinated the defense of their outer territories. I believe we have a problem. The Admiral's primary heads looked up from their respective displays, while his secondary head continued monitoring communications traffic. Explain, Captain. The human advance is proceeding exactly according to our operational models. They have engaged our forward scouts precisely where we expected them to. They have established supply bases in the locations our strategic computers identified as optimal. They have even suffered casualties at rates consistent with our projections. Admiral Vexthal's middle head tilted slightly, a gesture that indicated confusion among his species. This seems like good news rather than a problem. Sir, respectfully, when have humans ever done exactly what we expected them to do? The question hung in the air for several long seconds. Around them, the command center continued its steady hum of activity as hundreds of Draconian officers monitored the greatest military mobilization in the hegemony's 3,000-year history. 12 million soldiers for 1,000 capital ships, and the most advanced defensive systems ever constructed stood ready to repel the human invasion. All of it based on the assumption that they understood what the humans were actually trying to accomplish. Show me the engagement records from the forward zones, Admiral Vexthal commanded, his secondary heads now focusing entirely on the conversation. Captain Tichwhisera activated the holographic replay system, and suddenly they were looking down at a perfect recreation of the Kepler 442b encounter from 6 days earlier. Human ships approached the Draconian outpost in what appeared to be a standard assault formation. They exchanged fire with the defensive platforms. Several human vessels took damage and withdrew. Standard probe attack, Admiral Vexthal observed. Testing our defenses, gauging response times, gathering intelligence on our capabilities. Yes, sir. Exactly what our models predicted they would do. HFY advanced the replay to show similar engagements across a dozen different systems. Every encounter has followed the same pattern. The humans probe our defenses, we respond according to doctrine, they withdraw after suffering appropriate casualties. I still fail to see the problem. HFY paused the replay and highlighted specific details in the tactical analysis. Sir, in each of these engagements, the human casualties were almost exactly what our computers calculated they should be for forces of their size and composition engaging our defensive systems. Perhaps our intelligence assessment of their capabilities is more accurate than usual. Or perhaps they're deliberately suffering casualties at the exact rate we expect them to. HFY pulled up additional data streams. Analysis of their damaged vessels shows impact patterns consistent with deliberate exposure to our weapons. Examination of their tactical movements suggests they position themselves to receive fire rather than avoid it. Admiral Vexthal's 6 arms went very still, a danger sign among his people. Are you suggesting that the humans are intentionally taking losses? I am suggesting that nothing about this invasion makes sense when viewed through the lens of what we know about human warfare capabilities. HFY activated a new display showing comparative analysis of human military actions over the past century. Every previous human military campaign has been characterized by unpredictable tactics, asymmetric approaches, and the systematic exploitation of enemy expectations. Yet here they come, marching directly toward our strongest fortifications like something from the ancient wars. Exactly. HFY highlighted the current human advance routes on the star map. They're moving through space lanes that we have thoroughly fortified. They are approaching our defensive positions from directions that give us maximum advantage. They are behaving like an army from 3,000 years ago. The implications were staggering. Admiral Vexthal had commanded forces in 17 major campaigns against various species, and he had learned to read the patterns that preceded enemy deceptions. The humans were displaying all of the classic signs of a force that was not what it appeared to be. What is your assessment of their true intentions? He asked. HFY was quiet for a long moment, running through the data one more time to ensure her conclusions were sound. I believe this entire invasion is a deception. The question is what they are trying to hide. Deception on what scale? All of it, sir. I do not believe the humans intend to assault our fortifications directly. I believe they want us to think they are planning a conventional attack while they pursue some entirely different objective. Admiral Vexthal moved to the Central Command Station and began pulling up additional intelligence reports. The Hegemony spy network was vast and sophisticated, with agents and monitoring stations throughout the galaxy. If the humans were planning some alternative strategy, there should be evidence of it. Intelligence Division has reported no unusual human activity beyond the forces currently advancing toward our positions, he said after reviewing the latest summaries. No large-scale redeployments, no secret weapons programs, no diplomatic initiatives with our enemies, which could mean they're better at operational security than we have given them credit for, HFY replied. Or it could mean that whatever they are planning does not require any of those things. Explain. HFY activated a historical analysis program, pulling up records of previous human military campaigns. Sir, what is the one constant in every successful human operation we have studied? Admiral Vexthal considered the question carefully. He had spent months studying human tactics in preparation for this conflict, and while their approaches varied dramatically, there were certain underlying principles that seemed to guide all of their actions. They always seemed to understand their enemies better than those enemies understand themselves, he said finally. Exactly. Which raises the question, what do they understand about us that we do not understand about ourselves? The question was profoundly unsettling. The Draconian hegemony had existed for 3 millennia, had absorbed hundreds of species, had fought thousands of wars. Their military doctrine was refined through centuries of experience, their technology proven through countless conflicts. What could a relatively young species like humanity possibly understand about draconian civilization that the draconians themselves did not recognize? Have you identified any specific vulnerabilities they might be planning to exploit? Admiral Vexthal asked. That is what worries me most, sir. I cannot identify any obvious weakness in our position. Our defenses are comprehensive. Our intelligence networks are intact. Our supply lines are secure. Either the humans have discovered something we have missed, or they are planning something so unconventional that we lack the conceptual framework to recognize it. As if summoned by their conversation, the communications officer approached with a priority message. Admiral, we are receiving a transmission from the human fleet commander. They are requesting a meeting to discuss terms for our surrender. Admiral Vexthal's laugh was like the sound of grinding stone. How presumptuous. They send barely 10 million soldiers against the combined might of the hegemony, and expect us to surrender. Sir, said quietly, what if that is exactly the point? What do you mean? What if they want us to be outraged by their presumption? What if they want us to focus on the obvious impossibility of their position rather than questioning why they would make such an offer? The Admiral was beginning to see the pattern that had worried his intelligence officer. Everything about the human approach seemed designed to provoke predictable responses. They advanced in conventional formations, which encouraged conventional defensive preparations. They suffered expected casualties, which reinforced confidence in draconian tactical doctrine. They made impossible demands, which focused attention on their apparent arrogance rather than their possible hidden agenda. Should we respond to their request for a meeting? The communications officer asked. Admiral Vexthal looked at Captain Tikasra, who gave an almost imperceptible nod. Yes, arrange a neutral meeting. I want to see what they think they can accomplish. Sir, surely you do not intend to meet with them personally? Of course not. Send Captain Tichwisisara as my representative. If anyone can discern what the humans are actually planning, it will be her. 2 days later, Tichwisisara found herself aboard a neutral diplomatic vessel in the void between the advancing human fleet and the hegemony's outer defenses. The ship belonged to the Nexerian Trade Confederation, whose representatives had offered to mediate what they diplomatically termed discussions aimed at preventing unnecessary loss of life. The human delegation consisted of exactly 3 individuals. Tichwisisara had expected a larger group, perhaps including military advisors, technical specialists, and cultural attaches. Instead, she found herself facing a single uniformed human who introduced himself as General Marcus Webb, accompanied by 2 aides who seemed to be there primarily to operate recording equipment. General Webb was not what she had expected. He appeared to be middle-aged by human standards, with graying hair and the kind of calm demeanor that suggested extensive experience in high-stress situations. He moved with an economy of motion that reminded her of the special operations soldiers she had studied in intelligence briefings. Thank you for agreeing to this meeting, General Webb said as they settled around the conference table. I realize our request must have seemed somewhat presumptuous. That is one word for it, Tichwisisara replied carefully. Your forces are significantly outnumbered and facing defensive positions that have never been successfully assaulted. Yet you speak of our surrender as if it were inevitable. Perhaps because it is. General Webb's tone was matter-of-fact, as if he were discussing the weather rather than making an impossible claim. Though I suspect you are here because your intelligence analysis has raised questions about our approach. Tichwisisara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the ship's environmental systems. The human had just demonstrated detailed knowledge of internal hegemony discussions that should have been completely secure. You seem very well informed about our internal deliberations, she said. We make it our business to understand our opponents thoroughly. In your case, we have been studying draconian military doctrine and cultural patterns for approximately 73 years. 73 years? The current conflict has existed for less than 6 months. General Webb smiled, and there was something in that expression that made Tichwisisara's predatory instincts suddenly very alert. Captain, surely your intelligence training has taught you the difference between immediate conflicts and long-term strategic planning. You are saying that this war was planned decades ago. I am saying that humans begin preparing for wars that may never happen as soon as we become aware of potential future opponents. We have been studying the hegemony since our first contact with draconian merchants in the early 2280s. The implications were staggering. HFY Stories had assumed that the human military response was a reaction to recent hegemony expansion into territories that humans considered their sphere of influence. The possibility that this conflict was the culmination of nearly a century of preparation changed everything about the strategic calculation. "What exactly have you been preparing for?" she asked. "The eventual necessity of proving to the hegemony that continued expansion in our direction would be inadvisable." General Webb's tone remained conversational, but HFY Stories could sense something dangerous beneath the surface courtesy. "Your people have a remarkable talent for military conquest, Captain. 3,000 years of successful expansion across dozens of sectors. Hundreds of species absorbed into your empire. An impressive record. I sense you are building toward a point." "Indeed. The point is that your success has been based on consistent patterns of behavior that have proven effective against every opponent you have faced. You identify a target. You gather intelligence on their capabilities. You deploy overwhelming force in carefully coordinated campaigns. You absorb the defeated population into your social and economic systems." It was an accurate, if simplified, description of hegemony expansion doctrine. "The problem," General Webb continued, "is that this approach assumes your opponents will respond to overwhelming force in predictable ways. They will either surrender when faced with impossible odds, or they will fight conventional battles that they cannot win. And humans will not. Humans stopped fighting conventional battles sometime around the year 1200 CE. We have spent the subsequent 800 years learning how to turn conventional warfare against itself." General Webb activated a small holographic projector, and suddenly, the conference room was filled with a three-dimensional representation of the current theater of operations. HFY Stories could see the human fleet positions, the hegemony defensive installations, and the projected paths of the advancing forces. "Your strategic planning is based on the assumption that we intend to assault your fortifications directly," General Webb said, highlighting various elements of the display. "Your troop deployments, your resource allocation, your contingency planning all reflect this assumption, because that is what your forces appear to be preparing to do. Appearances can be deceptive. Tell me, Captain, what would happen to your empire if your capital world were suddenly to stop communicating with the rest of the hegemony?" The question seemed to come from nowhere, and HFY Stories found herself momentarily off balance. The capital world is the most heavily defended location in hegemony space. The idea of an assault on Draconis Prime is absurd. "I did not say anything about an assault. I asked what would happen if communication were severed." HFY Stories thought about it carefully. The hegemony was a vast, complex organization that depended on constant coordination between thousands of worlds and billions of citizens. The capital world served as the central nervous system for the entire empire, processing information and distributing orders to every corner of their territory. "Temporary disruption would cause confusion, but no lasting damage," she said. "However, if the communication blackout were extended, it would begin to interfere with trade, military coordination, and civil administration." "How extended?" "More than a few days would cause serious problems. More than a week would begin to threaten the stability of outer territories. More than a month would likely result in system-by-system breakdown of imperial authority." General Webb nodded, as if she had confirmed something he already knew. "And how long would it take your forces to investigate and resolve the cause of such a communication failure?" "That would depend on the nature of the failure. Technical problems could be resolved quickly. Enemy action would require a military response to clear the affected areas." "What if the problem were not in space at all, but on the surface of the capital world itself?" HFY Stories felt the same chill she had experienced earlier, but now it was accompanied by a growing sense of dread. The capital world has planetary defenses that could repel any conceivable assault. And even if enemy forces somehow reach the surface, the communication centers are located in heavily fortified installations deep underground. Underground installations that require power, air circulation, and waste disposal systems that connect to the planetary surface. General Webb's tone remained conversational, but his words carried implications that made Professor's skin crawl. "Tell me, how often are those utility systems inspected for unauthorized access?" "Security protocols require regular inspection of all critical infrastructure." HFY Stories began, then stopped as she realized what the human was suggesting. "You cannot possibly be implying that you have infiltrated the capital world's infrastructure systems." I'm not implying anything. I'm telling you directly that 73 years of preparation have included detailed study of every aspect of hegemony civilization, including the physical infrastructure that supports your government and military command systems. The conference room seemed to grow very quiet. Teacher Citra could hear her own breathing, could feel her heart rate increasing as the implications of the conversation became clear. This entire invasion is a diversion, she said quietly. The forces you see advancing toward your outer defenses represent approximately 40% of our total military capability, General Webb confirmed. They are certainly capable of engaging your forces in conventional battle if necessary. But their primary function is to focus your attention on the wrong location while we pursue our actual objectives, which are the temporary neutralization of hegemony command and control capabilities, followed by negotiations for a permanent ceasefire and establishment of agreed-upon territorial boundaries. HFY Stories stared at the human general, trying to process what she had just heard. You're talking about holding an entire galactic empire hostage. We are talking about demonstrating that continued hegemony expansion toward human space would be strategically inadvisable, General Webb corrected. Your empire will remain intact, your population will be unharmed, and your government will continue to function normally once our negotiations are concluded. And if we refuse to negotiate? General Webb's expression grew very serious. Captain, your people have built an impressive civilization over the past 3 millennia. It would be a tragedy to see that civilization destabilized because of a territorial dispute that could be resolved through diplomacy. The threat was politely stated but unmistakably clear. The humans had found a way to strike at the heart of the hegemony without engaging their military forces directly. If they had indeed infiltrated the capital world's infrastructure, they could cripple the Empire's ability to function without firing a single shot. How do I know you are not simply bluffing? HFY asked. General Webb smiled again, and this time there was no warmth in the expression at all. You will know in approximately 18 hours, when the scheduled maintenance cycle for the capital world's primary power grid experiences some unexpected complications. As if on cue, one of General Webb's aides handed him a small communication device. The human listened for a moment, then nodded and set the device aside. It appears our technical teams have completed their final preparations, he said. Captain, I would strongly recommend that you contact your superiors and advise them to begin seriously considering our terms for negotiation. And what are those terms? Establishment of a permanent border between hegemony space and human territory, along with a mutual non-aggression agreement and normalized trade relations. Very reasonable terms, considering the alternative. HFY realized that she was looking at something she had never encountered before, a human military operation that was simultaneously an act of war and an offer of peace. The humans were demonstrating their capability to destroy the hegemony while simultaneously proposing terms that would preserve it. Why, she asked. If you have the capability to bring down our entire empire, why offer negotiation at all? Why not simply demand unconditional surrender? General Webb was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice carried a weight that suggested he was sharing something important. Because we have learned that the best victories are the ones that leave your opponents capable of becoming your allies. The hegemony represents 3,000 years of accumulated knowledge, technology, and cultural achievement. It would be a waste to destroy all of that simply to resolve a territorial dispute. You want us to respect your borders, not to destroy our civilization. Exactly. We want to coexist as equals rather than as conqueror and conquered. But we also want to ensure that coexistence is based on mutual understanding of each other's capabilities. As the meeting concluded and HFY prepared to return to hegemony space, she found herself thinking about everything she had learned. The humans had spent decades preparing for a war that they hoped never to fight, developing capabilities that they preferred never to use, all in service of an objective that could have been achieved through simple diplomatic negotiation. Except that the hegemony would never have taken human diplomatic overtures seriously without a demonstration of their military capabilities. The humans had found a way to provide that demonstration while simultaneously offering the very diplomatic solution they had always preferred. As her shuttle departed from the neutral vessel, HFY could see the human fleet in the distance, still advancing toward hegemony space with mechanical precision. They looked exactly like what they appeared to be a conventional military force preparing for conventional battle. But now she knew better. Now she understood that she was looking at the most sophisticated deception in galactic history, one that had been planned and prepared for longer than most civilizations had existed. The humans had turned the entire concept of warfare into an elaborate negotiating strategy, using the threat of destruction to create the conditions for peace. Whether the hegemony would be wise enough to recognize the opportunity being offered remained to be seen. But as she watched the stars wheel past her shuttle's viewport, HFY Stories found herself hoping that her superiors would be smart enough to understand what she had learned during her brief conversation with General Webb. The humans had not come to conquer the hegemony. They had come to teach the hegemony something about the price of wisdom. Admiral Korthak Van of the Hegemony High Command stood in the emergency session chamber, his 6 arms gesticulating rapidly as he tried to explain the impossible situation that had developed over the past 12 hours. Around the circular chamber, the greatest military minds in Draconian space listened with growing horror to reports that defied everything they thought they knew about warfare. The primary communication array went dark at exactly 0400 Galactic Standard Time, he reported to the assembled commanders. Initial response protocols assumed technical failure and dispatched automated repair systems. Those systems reported successful completion of repairs, but communication remained non-functional. Supreme Marshal Vyth Kora leaned forward, her ancient scarred bulk casting shadows across the chamber floor. She had commanded hegemony forces for nearly 2 centuries, had overseen the conquest of 18 stellar systems, and had never encountered a problem that could not be solved through the systematic application of overwhelming force. What was the result of manual inspection? She asked. That is where the situation becomes unusual, Admiral Korthak Van replied. Physical inspection revealed that all equipment was functioning perfectly. Power systems operational, quantum processors running within normal parameters, relay networks showing green status across the board. There was no technical reason for the communication failure. Then what was the cause? Admiral Korthak Van activated the chamber's central holographic display, showing a detailed schematic of the capital world's communication infrastructure. Technical analysis revealed that someone had introduced modifications to the quantum encryption protocols that govern interstellar communication traffic. Sabotage. Sophisticated sabotage. The modifications were so subtle that they passed through every security check and appeared to be legitimate system updates. They only became apparent when our cryptographic specialists began reverse engineering the failure. Supreme Marshal Vyth Kora's 4 primary eyes focused intently on the display. Who has the capability to perform such modifications? According to our intelligence analysis, only 3 civilizations in the galaxy possess the technical sophistication necessary for this level of quantum encryption manipulation. Admiral Korthak Van highlighted specific sections of the schematic. The ethereal collective, the synthetic hegemony, and the humans, Supreme Marshal Vyth Kora finished grimly. Yes, Marshal, but the methodology used in these modifications matches known human cybernetic warfare techniques. Additionally, the timing coincides exactly with Captain Kaiser's report from her meeting with the human commander. Around the chamber, the assembled commanders began to murmur among themselves. The implications were staggering. If the humans had indeed infiltrated the capital world's communication systems, they had achieved something that no enemy in hegemony history had ever accomplished. What is the current status of our communication capabilities? Supreme Marshal Vyth Kora asked. All interstellar communications remain non-functional. We can communicate within the capital system using conventional radio and quantum entanglement protocols, but any attempt to contact our forces in other systems results in complete signal failure. And our efforts to reverse this sabotage? Admiral Korthak Van's expression grew even more grim. That is perhaps the most disturbing aspect of this situation. Every time our technical teams identify and attempt to remove one of the human modifications, 2 more appear elsewhere in the system. Explain. The sabotage appears to be self-replicating and adaptive. The humans did not simply plant a single virus or modify a few key systems. They have somehow introduced an artificial intelligence into our communication infrastructure that actively resists our attempts to repair the damage. Supreme Marshal Vyth Kora was quiet for several long moments, processing the implications of what she had heard. In 2 centuries of military command, She had faced every conceivable form of warfare. She had dealt with biological weapons, temporal distortion fields, reality-altering technologies, and artificial beings of terrifying intelligence. But she had never encountered an enemy that could turn her own infrastructure against her while remaining physically undetectable. "What other systems have been compromised?" she asked. "We are still conducting a comprehensive analysis, but preliminary investigations suggest that similar modifications may have been made to power distribution networks, transportation control systems, and possibly even our military command protocols." The chamber fell silent. If the humans had indeed infiltrated all of those systems, they had effectively gained control over the entire planetary infrastructure of the hegemony capital. "How was such infiltration possible?" demanded General Kexthal from across the chamber. "The capital world security protocols have been developed and refined over 3 millennia. Every system is isolated, encrypted, and monitored by dedicated security artificial intelligences." Admiral Korthak Ven pulled up additional data displays showing the results of ongoing security investigations. Analysis suggests that the infiltration occurred over an extended period of time, possibly decades. The humans appear to have gained access through maintenance and upgrade channels, introducing their modifications gradually as part of routine system improvements. Decades. Supreme Marshal Wojtykora's voice carried a dangerous edge. "You are suggesting the human agents have been operating on the capital world for decades without detection?" "Not necessarily human agents, Marshal. The modifications appear to have been introduced through automated systems that mimic standard technical upgrade procedures. Anyone with sufficient knowledge of our infrastructure could theoretically have implemented these changes through remote access." "Through our own maintenance protocols?" "Exactly. The humans studied our infrastructure procedures so thoroughly that they were able to create upgrade packages that appeared to be legitimate improvements to system functionality. Our own technical staff unknowingly installed the sabotage while believing they were implementing authorized enhancements. The implications were breathtaking in their audacity. The humans had not merely infiltrated the hegemony's defenses. They had convinced the hegemony to infiltrate itself. "What is the timeline for restoration of normal communications?" Supreme Marshal Wojtykora asked. "Unknown, Marshal. Every time we believe we have isolated the source of the interference, it adapts and manifests in new ways. Our most optimistic projections suggest several weeks of intensive work by our best technical specialists." "Weeks?" The word came out as a roar of rage. "We have 12 million soldiers engaged with human forces in the outer territories, and you tell me we cannot communicate with them for weeks?" "Marshal, there's another consideration." Admiral Korthak Ven's voice carried the tone of someone delivering news that would not be well received. "If the humans have indeed gained control over our infrastructure, they may be able to monitor our communications even when we succeed in restoring them." "Meaning what exactly?" "Meaning that any orders we send to our field commanders may be intercepted and analyzed by human intelligence. Worse, the humans may be able to modify our orders in transit, causing our own forces to receive instructions that we never sent." Supreme Marshal Wojtykora was beginning to understand the true sophistication of the human strategy. This was not merely sabotage. It was the systematic subversion of the hegemony's entire command and control apparatus. "What do we know about the status of our forces in the field?" she asked. "Limited information from automated systems suggests that our defensive positions remain intact, and our fleets continue to monitor human advance routes. However, we have had no direct communication with field commanders since the communications blackout began. Then, for all practical purposes, we are commanding blind." "Yes, Marshal. We cannot coordinate between different defensive positions, cannot respond to changing tactical situations, and cannot adapt our strategy based on field intelligence." A new voice entered the conversation as General Thekvar activated his communication node from across the chamber. "Marshal, we have just received a priority message through the Planetary Defense Network. It appears to have come from the human fleet." "Put it through." The chamber's holographic display shifted to show a human figure that several of the commanders recognized from intelligence briefings. General Marcus Webb appeared calm and professional as he addressed the assembled Draconian leadership. "Supreme Marshal Wojtykora, I trust that you are beginning to understand the nature of our capabilities. As agreed during our meeting with Captain T. Sisura, we have demonstrated our ability to disrupt your command and control systems without causing permanent damage to your infrastructure or harm to your population. Supreme Marshal Vehikura's rage was carefully controlled but clearly visible. You have committed an act of war against the sovereign territory of the Draconian hegemony. We have demonstrated the vulnerability of your sovereign territory to forms of warfare that you have not previously encountered, General Webb corrected politely. This demonstration could easily be extended to include your power distribution systems, your transportation networks, your banking and trade infrastructures, and your planetary defense networks. Are you threatening to attack civilian targets? I am informing you that the distinction between military and civilian targets becomes meaningless when your enemy controls the infrastructure that supports both. However, we have no desire to cause unnecessary hardship for your population. General Webb's image gestured, and additional displays appeared showing detailed schematics of the sabotage that have been implemented throughout the Capital World systems. As you can see, our modifications to your infrastructure are designed to be completely reversible. When our negotiations are concluded successfully, we will provide you with the technical specifications necessary to remove all traces of our presence from your systems. And if we refuse to negotiate, then you will discover that 73 years of preparation have given us a very comprehensive understanding of how to bring a complex technological civilization to a complete standstill without firing a single shot. Supreme Marshal Vyth Cora found herself in a position she had never experienced before. She commanded the largest military force in galactic history, possessed technology that could sterilize entire star systems, and had access to weapons that could crack planets in half. Yet she was effectively helpless against an enemy that had turned her own infrastructure into their weapon. "What are your terms?" she asked finally. "The same terms we offered through Captain HFY. Establishment of permanent borders between hegemony space and human territory, mutual non-aggression agreements, and normalization of trade relations. In addition, we would like to propose some collaborative efforts in the areas of technology sharing and cultural exchange. You disable our entire command structure and then propose cultural exchange?" General Webb's expression remained diplomatically neutral. "Supreme Marshal, we did not disable your command structure to demonstrate hostility. We disabled it to demonstrate that the era of expansion through military conquest is coming to an end. The galaxy is becoming too small and too interconnected for civilizations to continue resolving territorial disputes through warfare. So you resort to warfare to teach us not to resort to warfare. We resort to demonstration to teach you that warfare itself is changing. The humans you see advancing toward your outer territories represent the old model of military conflict. The capabilities we have just demonstrated represent the new model. And what is the new model? Control of information, infrastructure, and the technological systems that modern civilizations depend upon for survival. Your people have spent 3 millennia learning to conquer territory through superior firepower. We have spent the last century learning to render firepower irrelevant by controlling the systems that support it. Supreme Marshal Vyth Cora was beginning to understand something that chilled her more than the immediate tactical situation. The humans were not simply demonstrating their ability to disrupt hegemony operations. They were demonstrating that traditional military superiority meant nothing against an enemy that could attack civilization itself rather than military forces. "You're talking about the end of conventional warfare," she said. "We're talking about the evolution of conventional warfare. Physical conquest of territory becomes meaningless when you can control that territory's infrastructure from the other side of the galaxy. Military superiority becomes irrelevant when you can turn an enemy's own systems against them. Then, what you are offering is not negotiation. It is surrender to a new form of tyranny." General Webb shook his head. "What we are offering is partnership in developing new models for inter-civilizational relations that do not depend on the threat of mutual destruction. The capabilities we have demonstrated today could be used to devastate the hegemony. But they could also be used to enhance your technological infrastructure, improve your communication systems, and create new opportunities for collaboration. The same capabilities that can destroy us can also improve us. Technology is a tool, Supreme Marshal. Its impact depends entirely on how it is used. We are offering to use these capabilities constructively rather than destructively, but only if you are willing to participate in building something better than the current system of competitive expansion. Supreme Marshal Vyth Kura looked around the chamber at her fellow commanders. These were beings who had devoted their entire lives to the art of warfare, who had built their identities around military conquest and territorial expansion. Yet they were facing an enemy that had made military conquest obsolete. "How do we know you will honor any agreement we make?" she asked. "If you can infiltrate our systems once, you can do so again." "You cannot know that we will honor our agreements," General Webb replied honestly, "just as we cannot know that you will honor yours. But we can build verification systems, establish monitoring protocols, and create mutual accountability mechanisms that make violations expensive and difficult to conceal. And if we refuse your offer entirely, then you will discover that your current communication difficulties are merely the beginning of what we can accomplish when we choose to be genuinely hostile rather than merely demonstrative." The threat was politely stated, but its implications were clear. The humans had shown remarkable restraint in their demonstration of capabilities. If they chose to remove that restraint, the consequences for the hegemony could be catastrophic. "We need time to consider your proposal," Supreme Marshal Vyth Kura said finally. "Of course. However, I should point out that your forces in the outer territories are currently operating without central coordination. Each day that passes increases the likelihood of tactical mistakes that could lead to unnecessary casualties on both sides. How long do we have?" "Our fleet will continue its advance for another 72 hours. If we have not received a preliminary response to our proposal by that time, we will begin implementing additional demonstrations of our capabilities." "What sort of demonstrations?" General Webb's expression grew very serious. "The kind that will make your current communication problems seem trivial by comparison." The transmission ended, leaving the assembled hegemony commanders to contemplate a situation unlike anything in their recorded history. They possessed overwhelming military superiority, yet they were effectively powerless. They commanded the largest empire in the galaxy, yet they could not communicate with their own forces. They had spent 3 millennia developing the art of warfare, only to discover that warfare itself had evolved beyond their understanding. "Recommendations?" Supreme Marshal Vyth Kura asked the assembled officers. The silence stretched for several long minutes as each commander wrestled with the implications of what they had witnessed. Finally, Admiral Korthak Ven spoke. "Marshal, from a purely military perspective, we are facing a form of warfare for which we have no effective defense. Our entire strategic doctrine is based on the assumption that we can identify and engage enemy forces directly. The humans have demonstrated the ability to attack us without presenting any targets for retaliation. You recommend surrender? I recommend negotiation. The humans have demonstrated that they could destroy us if they chose to do so. The fact that they prefer to negotiate suggests that their ultimate objectives may be compatible with the continued existence of the hegemony." General Thekvar leaned forward, his scarred features reflecting decades of successful campaigns. "The humans are right about one thing. The nature of warfare is changing. If we refuse to adapt to these new realities, we risk becoming obsolete regardless of our military superiority. But if we agree to their terms, we effectively acknowledge that military conquest is no longer a viable strategy for expansion. Perhaps it is time to consider whether expansion through conquest is still necessary," suggested General Kexthal quietly. "The hegemony controls nearly a quarter of the galaxy. Our population has stable access to resources, our technology continues to advance, our civilization prospers. What do we gain from continued territorial expansion that justifies the risks we now face?" Supreme Marshal Vyth Kura realized that her commanders were grappling with questions that went far beyond immediate tactical concerns. The human demonstration had forced them to confront fundamental assumptions about the nature of civilization, the purpose of military power, and the future of interspecies relations. "Very well," she said finally. "Admiral Korthak Ven, draft a preliminary response accepting the human invitation to formal negotiations. General Thekvar, begin developing contingency plans for a galaxy in which territorial expansion through military conquest is no longer feasible. General Kexthal, initiate a comprehensive review of our strategic objectives and determine which of them can be achieved through cooperation rather than conquest. And if the humans prove to be deceptive about their intentions?" Admiral Korthak Ven asked. Supreme Marshal Vojtychkora's expression grew grim. Then, we will learn to fight the same kind of war they have just demonstrated. And we will hope that we can learn fast enough to survive the experience. As the emergency session concluded and the commanders dispersed to begin implementing their new directives, Supreme Marshal Vojtychkora remained in the chamber, staring at the star charts that showed the extent of hegemony territory. For 3,000 years, the hegemony had grown through the systematic conquest of neighboring civilizations. Each victory had validated their approach. Each successful campaign had reinforced their confidence in the superiority of their military doctrine. Now, in the span of a single day, all of that had been called into question by an enemy that fought wars by rewriting the rules of warfare itself. The humans had not simply defeated the hegemony. They had taught the hegemony that the era of victory through military superiority was ending, and that survival in the new era would require entirely different kinds of strength. Dr. Elena Vasquez stood in the observation deck of the research vessel Meridian, watching the final phases of what historians would later call the Draconian crisis unfold in the space beyond. As the chief xenopsychologist for the Human Diplomatic Corps, she had been present during the months of preparation that had led to this moment, but she had never quite believed that the plan would work as intended. Now, as she watched Draconian and human fleet elements maneuvering in carefully coordinated patterns around the neutral space station that had been designated for the final negotiations, she began to understand that she had witnessed something unprecedented in galactic history. It's remarkable, isn't it? The voice belonged to Dr. James Chun, the cultural anthropologist who had spent the last 15 years studying Draconian civilization. 6 months ago, both sides were preparing for the largest interstellar war in recorded history. Today, they're working together to establish the framework for permanent peace. Elena nodded, though her attention was focused on the subtle details of the fleet movements below. Even now, at the moment of apparent resolution, both sides maintained a posture of forces ready for immediate combat. Trust, it seemed, would take considerably longer to develop than mutual understanding. What strikes me most is how completely the Draconians have restructured their strategic thinking, she said. Everything we know about their culture suggested that they would view any challenge to their military supremacy as an existential threat requiring total war. They probably did, initially, Dr. Chen replied. But the humans gave them something they had never encountered before, a demonstration of superior capability that was simultaneously an offer of partnership. Elena activated her personal data recorder, pulling up the psychological analysis reports that had been compiled during the negotiations. The key insight was understanding that Draconian aggression stems from a deep-seated need for security rather than simple territorial ambition. Once they understood that humans represented a form of power that could protect rather than threaten their civilization, their entire response pattern changed. It helped that we offered them something genuinely valuable, Dr. Chen added. The technological integration proposals don't just benefit human objectives. They actually enhance Draconian capabilities in ways they never could have achieved independently. Through the observation port, Elena could see the massive bulk of a Draconian command vessel slowly approaching the human flagship. The symbolism was powerful. Two species that had prepared for mutual annihilation now demonstrating their willingness to cooperate at the highest levels of military command. "There's Admiral Thompson," Elena said, pointing toward the human vessel. She had worked closely with the Admiral during the preparation phase, helping to develop the psychological profiles that had guided the entire operation. "I still can't quite believe he convinced the Joint Chiefs to approve a strategy based on deliberately making ourselves look vulnerable." The false casualty reports were brilliant, Dr. Chen agreed. By allowing the Draconians to believe they were inflicting expected damage on our forces, we reinforced their confidence in traditional military assessment while simultaneously gathering intelligence on their tactical responses. Elena pulled up the operational timeline on her recorder, reviewing the months of careful preparation that had made the final confrontation possible. The infrastructure infiltration alone required 3 years of planning and implementation. We had to understand their technology so thoroughly that we could improve it while simultaneously subverting it. And we had to do it in a way that demonstrated superiority without triggering the kind of desperation response that might have led to genuine warfare. The complexity of the operation had been staggering. Human intelligence services had spent decades studying every aspect of Draconian civilization, from their military doctrine to their cultural values to the specific technical specifications of their infrastructure systems. The final plan had required coordination between diplomatic, military, intelligence, and technical resources on a scale that had never before been attempted. What I find most interesting, Elena said, is how the operation required us to understand ourselves as much as we understood them. We had to predict our own responses to their moves with the same accuracy we used to predict their responses to ours. Game theory applied to interstellar relations, Dr. Chun mused. Though I suspect the mathematical models don't capture the full complexity of what we accomplished. A soft chime indicated an incoming communication from the negotiation station. Elena accepted the transmission and found herself looking at the face of Ambassador Sarah Okafor, the chief human negotiator. Elena, James, I wanted to give you a final update before the signing ceremony begins, Ambassador Okafor said. Her expression showed the strain of weeks of intensive negotiations, but there was satisfaction in her voice. The Draconians have agreed to all of our primary objectives and most of our secondary ones. How are they responding to the technology-sharing provisions? Elena asked. Better than we had hoped. Supreme Marshal Vyth Hura has been remarkably pragmatic about adapting to new realities. She seems to understand that the alternatives to cooperation are considerably less appealing than the benefits of collaboration. Dr. Chun leaned into the communication pickup. What about their concerns regarding our intelligence capabilities? They've accepted the establishment of mutual monitoring systems and joint oversight committees for sensitive technological developments. Both sides will have observers in each other's research facilities, and both sides will have access to verification protocols for treaty compliance. Elena reviewed her psychological assessment notes. That represents a remarkable shift in their approach to security. Traditional Draconian doctrine emphasized unilateral control over all strategic assets. The demonstration of our infrastructure penetration capabilities convinced them that unilateral security is no longer feasible, Ambassador Okafor explained. They recognize that in an era where any sufficiently advanced civilization can potentially compromise another civilization's infrastructure, security must be based on mutual trust and verification rather than isolation and deterrence. Elena found this development fascinating from a psychological perspective. The Draconians had built their entire civilization around the concept of defensive superiority, yet they were now voluntarily accepting a security model that required them to make themselves transparent to potential enemies. The signing ceremony will begin in approximately 1 hour, Ambassador Okafor continued. I wanted to make sure you had the opportunity to observe the final phase of what we've all been working toward. As the transmission ended, Elena turned her attention back to the view outside the observation port. The space around the negotiation station was now filled with vessels from both species, their formations creating a complex pattern that seemed almost ceremonial in its precision. You know what strikes me most about this entire operation? Dr. Chun said as they watched the preparations below. We didn't actually defeat the Draconians. We convinced them to defeat themselves. Elena considered this observation carefully. More accurately, we convinced them that their traditional definition of victory was no longer relevant to their actual objectives. By demonstrating that we understood their objectives better than they did, by demonstrating that their objectives could be achieved more effectively through cooperation than through conquest. It was a subtle but important distinction. The humans had not simply imposed their will on the Draconians through superior force. Instead, they had shown the Draconians that their fundamental goals, security, prosperity, cultural preservation, could be better achieved through partnership than through traditional military expansion. The really remarkable thing, Elena continued, is that we accomplished this while simultaneously achieving our own objectives. The treaty arrangements don't just prevent Draconian expansion into human space. They create opportunities for technological and cultural exchange that will benefit both species. Dr. Chun activated his own data recorder, pulling up the preliminary assessments of the treaty terms. The joint research initiatives alone represent the largest collaborative scientific effort in galactic history. The Draconians get access to our information processing and infrastructure security technologies. We get access to their materials science and energy generation systems. And both sides get the security of knowing that the other side has a vested interest in maintaining peaceful relations. Elena had spent years studying the psychology of interspecies conflict, and She understood that the most durable peace agreements were those that made cooperation more profitable than conflict for all parties involved. The humans had structured their offer to the Draconians in precisely that manner. There's another aspect to this that I find particularly interesting, she said, pulling up her analysis of Draconian cultural responses to the human demonstration. The way we revealed our capabilities seems to have triggered a kind of cultural evolution within Draconian society. How so? Traditional Draconian culture valued military prowess above all other achievements. But our demonstration showed them a form of power that transcended traditional military capability. They're now reconceptualizing strength in ways that include technological sophistication, strategic intelligence, and operational complexity. Dr. Chen nodded thoughtfully. So we didn't just change their strategic calculations. We changed their fundamental values. We gave them new examples of what strength could look like. And because Draconian culture genuinely respects superior capability, they've begun to adopt our models of achievement in addition to their own. Through the observation port, Elena could see shuttlecraft moving between the various vessels, carrying the dignitaries and officials who would participate in the signing ceremony. The logistical complexity of coordinating such an event between two species with completely different cultural protocols was staggering. It was being managed with the same precision that had characterized the entire operation. You know what I think will be the most significant long-term consequence of this crisis? Elena said. What's that? We've established a new model for how advanced civilizations can interact with each other. Instead of competition ending in either conquest or stalemate, we've shown that it can end in mutual enhancement. Assuming the treaty holds. Elena smiled. Oh, it will hold. We've made sure that both sides have too much to lose by breaking it. Dr. Chen looked puzzled. The enforcement mechanisms? The enforcement mechanisms are part of it. But the real guarantee is that we've structured the relationship so that both species will become dependent on the collaborative technologies we're developing together. Breaking the treaty would mean giving up capabilities that neither side can replicate independently. It was the ultimate expression of human strategic thinking, creating conditions where cooperation became not just preferable, but essential for continued prosperity. There's Admiral Thompson's shuttle, Dr. Chen observed, pointing toward a sleek human vessel that was approaching the station. Elena had worked closely with Admiral Thompson during the planning phases of the operation, and she had developed a deep respect for his ability to think beyond traditional military categories. The strategy that had brought them to this point had required a commander who could simultaneously plan for warfare and diplomacy, who could threaten destruction while offering partnership. He's probably the only human admiral who could have pulled this off, she said. The operation required someone who understood that the most devastating victory is the one that turns your enemy into your ally. By demonstrating that you could destroy them while proving that you prefer to elevate them? Exactly. The Draconians respect strength, but they also value wisdom. Admiral Thompson found a way to demonstrate both simultaneously. As the time for the signing ceremony approached, Elena found herself reflecting on the broader implications of what they had accomplished. The Draconian crisis would be studied by diplomatic and military academies for centuries, not just as an example of successful conflict resolution, but as a demonstration of how advanced civilizations might learn to coexist in an increasingly crowded galaxy. Do you think this model will work with other species? Dr. Chun asked, as if reading her thoughts. Elena considered the question carefully. I think it will work with any species that values rational self-interest over emotional satisfaction. The key insight is that most conflicts between advanced civilizations are based on misunderstandings about each other's capabilities and intentions. So if the solution is better intelligence and more sophisticated communication, the solution is demonstrating your capabilities in ways that simultaneously reveal your intentions. The Draconians couldn't understand our true objectives until they understood our true capabilities. Once they grasped both, cooperation became the obvious choice. A new communications signal indicated that the signing ceremony was about to begin. Elena and Dr. Chund made their way to the designated observation area, where they would have a direct view of the proceedings. The ceremony itself was remarkable for its simplicity. After months of complex negotiations and years of careful preparation, the formal establishment of peace between two galactic powers came down to a series of signatures on documents that had been crafted with obsessive attention to every possible contingency. Supreme Marshal the YTH Coruscant for the Draconian hegemony with the kind of crisp efficiency that characterized all of her actions. Admiral Thompson signed for the Human Coalition with equal precision. Ambassador Okafor and her Draconian counterpart added their signatures to confirm the diplomatic protocols. And just like that, the largest potential war in galactic history became the foundation for the largest collaborative effort in galactic history. You know what this really represents? Elena said as they watched the concluding ceremonies. What's that? It's proof that intelligence can overcome instinct. Both of our species have predatory, evolutionary backgrounds. Both of our cultures developed through conquest and territorial expansion. But when we were faced with a situation where traditional responses would have been mutually destructive, we found a way to transcend our programming. Dr. Chin smiled. The triumph of wisdom over war. The triumph of understanding over assumption, Elena corrected. The humans succeeded because we took the time to truly comprehend what the Draconians needed and wanted. The Draconians succeeded because they were willing to accept new definitions of strength and security. As the ceremony concluded and the various delegations began to disperse, Elena found herself thinking about the years of work that had led to this moment. Thousands of people had contributed to the operation, from intelligence analysts who had mapped Draconian infrastructure to cultural specialists who had identified the psychological triggers that would make cooperation appealing. The really remarkable thing, she said as they prepared to leave the observation area, is that we accomplished all of this without anyone dying. No battle casualties, no civilian casualties, no collateral damage from infrastructure disruption. Dr. Chin agreed. It may be the first major interstellar conflict in history to be resolved with zero fatalities. Because it was never really about conflict at all, Elena realized. It was about communication. We just had to find a language that the Draconians would understand. And that language turned out to be demonstration of capability combined with restraint in the use of that capability. Exactly. We showed them what we could do while proving that we preferred not to do it. As their shuttle departed from the negotiation station, Elena took one last look at the combined human and Draconian fleets that were now beginning their coordinated return to their respective territories. In a few weeks, those same vessels would be working together to establish the joint research facilities and monitoring stations that would ensure continued cooperation between the two species. What's your prediction for the long-term success of this arrangement? Dr. Chun asked as they settled in for the journey back to human space. Elena considered the question carefully. I think we've solved the immediate problem of territorial conflict between humans and Draconians. But more importantly, I think we've created a model that will influence how other species approach similar situations. A diplomatic revolution, an evolutionary step in how intelligent species interact with each other. For the first time in galactic history, we've demonstrated that advanced civilizations can resolve fundamental conflicts through enhanced understanding rather than enhanced destruction. As the stars wheeled past their shuttle's viewport, Elena found herself hoping that other species would learn from what they had accomplished. The galaxy was becoming increasingly crowded with advanced civilizations, and the traditional approaches to territorial and resource disputes were becoming increasingly dangerous. The humans had proven that there was an alternative. Now it remained to be seen whether the rest of the galaxy was wise enough to follow their example. Ambassador Zekthari returned to Nexus Station exactly 1 year after the resolution of the Draconian crisis. But the installation he found bore little resemblance to the military staging ground he had observed during the human mobilization. Where once there had been endless rows of human soldiers preparing for war, there are now research facilities, cultural exchange centers, and the headquarters of what had become known throughout the galaxy as the Cooperative Development Initiative. The transformation was so complete that he initially questioned whether he had arrived at the correct coordinates. Remarkable, is it not? Admiral Korath was waiting for him at the station's primary docking facility, and the Valerian's 4 eyes tracked the busy activity around them with obvious fascination. A year ago, this was a staging ground for what we all believed would be the most destructive war in galactic history. Today, it is the center of the largest collaborative research effort ever undertaken by multiple species. Zekthari's tentacles writhed slightly as he processed the scene before him. Human and Draconian scientists worked side by side at research stations that combined technologies from both civilizations. Cultural exchange students from dozens of different species move through corridors that have been redesigned to accommodate a variety of anatomical configurations. Most remarkably, the entire installation operated under joint human-draconian administration, with decisions made through consensus protocols that had been specifically designed to bridge the gap between two completely different approaches to governance. I confess, I had not expected such rapid progress, Zektheri said as they made their way toward the diplomatic quarters. The reports we received suggested successful implementation of the treaty terms, but this represents something far more significant than mere compliance with agreements. Indeed, what we are witnessing is the emergence of an entirely new model for interspecies cooperation, Admiral Korath replied. The humans and Draconians have moved beyond simple, peaceful coexistence to create something that neither species could have achieved independently. As they walked through the station's central corridor, Zektheri could see evidence of the integration Admiral Korath described. Human information processing systems had been merged with Draconian computational technologies to create hybrid networks that operated with unprecedented efficiency. Draconian materials science had been combined with human engineering innovation to produce structural designs that defied conventional understanding of what was possible with known materials. Most intriguingly, the collaboration had produced emergent capabilities that seemed to transcend the sum of their constituent parts. What have they accomplished that has attracted such attention from across the galaxy? Zektheri asked. Admiral Korath activated a portable holographic projector, displaying a three-dimensional representation of what appeared to be a star system, but one unlike anything in Zektheri's experience. The primary star was surrounded by artificial structures of staggering complexity, with energy flows and material streams creating patterns that suggested some form of active stellar engineering. This is the Kepler 442 system, approximately 70 light-years from here, Admiral Korath explained. 6 months ago, it contained nothing but a red dwarf star and a collection of barren rocky planets. The human Draconian research teams have transformed it into a demonstration of what they call cooperative stellar engineering. Zektheri stared at the display, trying to comprehend the implications of what he was seeing. They have modified an entire star system? Not modified, optimized. Using human information processing capabilities and Draconian energy manipulation technologies, they have created what amounts to a massive computational and manufacturing facility powered directly by stellar fusion. To what end? The production of technologies that neither species could have developed independently. Advanced materials that exist only under specific quantum conditions. Information processing systems that operate at speeds approaching the theoretical limits of physical computation. Energy storage and transmission systems that make interstellar power distribution feasible for the first time in galactic history. The implications were staggering. Zektheri had assumed that the Human-Draconian alliance was primarily defensive in nature, designed to prevent future conflicts through mutual deterrence. The possibility that it was actually producing technological advances that surpassed anything previously achieved by galactic civilization had not occurred to him. Are they sharing these technologies with other species? He asked. That is what makes this development so remarkable, Admiral Korath said, advancing the holographic display to show additional star systems. They're not hoarding their advances. Instead, they're actively seeking collaborative partners from other civilizations. Partners for what? For the implementation of what they call the Galactic Development Protocol, a systematic effort to enhance the technological and social capabilities of every advanced civilization in the galaxy through cooperative research and resource sharing. Zektheri felt a familiar chill as he began to understand the scope of what the humans and Draconians were proposing. They want to integrate the entire galaxy into their collaborative model. They want to offer the entire galaxy the opportunity to benefit from their collaborative model, Admiral Korath corrected. Participation is entirely voluntary, but the advantages of cooperation are becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. As if summoned by their conversation, a new figure approached them through the corridor. Zektheri recognized Dr. Elena Vasquez from the intelligence briefings that had preceded his visit. The human xenopsychologist had been one of the key architects of the original human strategy during the Draconian crisis. Ambassador Zektheri, Admiral Korath, she said, greeting them with the kind of warm professionalism that characterized human diplomatic interactions. I understand you are here to evaluate the current state of human-draconian cooperation for the Galactic Council? Among other things, Zektheri replied carefully. We are also interested in understanding the implications of your technological developments for other civilizations. Dr. Vasquez smiled, and there was something in that expression that reminded Zektheri of the predatory confidence he had observed in human soldiers a year ago. Perhaps you would like to see a demonstration of what we have accomplished? They were led to an observation deck that overlooked one of the station's primary research facilities. Through the transparent walls, Zektheri could see dozens of beings from multiple species working at equipment that seemed to combine familiar technologies in completely unfamiliar configurations. What you are observing, Dr. Vasquez explained, is a real-time collaborative research effort involving 12 different civilizations. The project goal is the development of a universal translation matrix that will enable instantaneous communication between any two species regardless of their biological or technological differences. Universal translation has been attempted many times, Admiral Korath observed. The linguistic and conceptual barriers between species have always proven insurmountable. True, when approached from the perspective of any single civilization's understanding of communication and cognition, Dr. Vasquez agreed. But when you combine the insights of 12 different species, each of which has developed unique approaches to information processing and conceptual representation, previously insurmountable problems become manageable challenges. Zektheri watched the researchers below, noting the fluid way they moved between different workstations and collaborated on tasks that seemed to require expertise from multiple species. How do they coordinate their efforts? Through the same hybrid information processing systems that emerged from human-draconian cooperation, Dr. Vasquez explained. We have developed communication protocols that allow beings with completely different cognitive architectures to share ideas directly, without the information loss that typically accompanies translation between species. You have solved the communication problem by making communication itself more efficient. We have solved the communication problem by recognizing that intelligence itself is more varied and more powerful than any single species had previously realized. When you combine human pattern recognition with draconian logical processing, Valerian spatial reasoning, Nexerian social modeling, and the cognitive capabilities of 8 other species, you get a form of collective intelligence that surpasses anything any of us could achieve independently. The implications were breathtaking. Zektheri had come to Nexus Station expecting to observe the aftermath of a successful diplomatic resolution. Instead, he was witnessing what appeared to be the emergence of a new form of galactic civilization. What response have you received from other species? He asked. Overwhelming interest, Dr. Vasquez replied. We currently have formal cooperation agreements with 23 civilizations and preliminary discussions underway with another 15. The benefits of participation are becoming increasingly apparent as our collaborative capabilities expand. And what about species that choose not to participate? Dr. Vasquez was quiet for a moment, and Zektheri sensed that she was choosing her words carefully. Participation remains entirely voluntary. However, we have found that civilizations that embrace collaborative development tend to advance more rapidly than those that maintain traditional isolationist approaches. Are you suggesting that non-participating species will be left behind? I'm suggesting that the rate of technological and social development within the collaborative network is accelerating beyond what any individual civilization can match through independent research. Admiral Korath leaned forward, his attention clearly focused on the implications of what Dr. Vasquez had said. How significant is the developmental advantage? In the years since the Draconian crisis was resolved, the collaborative network has achieved advances that our individual projections suggested would have taken decades of independent research. The synergistic effects of combining multiple forms of intelligence and multiple technological approaches have exceeded our most optimistic predictions. Zektheri felt the same unsettling sensation he had experienced when watching human soldiers prepare for war. Once again, he was confronting evidence that humans operated on timescales and according to principles that most other species did not fully comprehend. This entire development was planned from the beginning, was it not? He asked quietly. Dr. Vasquez looked at him with the kind of expression that suggested he had asked exactly the question she had been expecting. The specific outcome was not planned, but the principles that made it possible were certainly incorporated into our original strategy. Explain. The human approach to the Draconian crisis was based on the recognition that the most effective way to prevent future conflicts is to create conditions where cooperation becomes more valuable than competition. We demonstrated our capabilities to the Draconians not just to deter aggression, but to establish the foundation for partnership. But surely you did not anticipate that this partnership would expand to encompass multiple species. We anticipated that successful demonstration of cooperative advantages would attract attention from other civilizations. What we did not anticipate was how rapidly collaborative research would begin producing results that no individual species could achieve independently. Zektheri was beginning to understand that he was witnessing something unprecedented in galactic history. The humans had not simply resolved a territorial dispute with the Draconians. They had created a new model for how advanced civilizations could relate to each other, and that model was proving so effective that it was beginning to transform the nature of galactic civilization itself. What happens to species that cannot or will not adapt to this new model? He asked. Nothing happens to them, Dr. Vasquez replied. They continue to exist and develop according to their own preferences and capabilities. But they do so in a galaxy where other civilizations are advancing through collaborative enhancement. A galaxy where traditional competitive advantages may become irrelevant. A galaxy where traditional competitive disadvantages can be overcome through cooperative participation. Admiral Korath activated his communication device and pulled up a galactic star chart showing current political and economic relationships. Ambassador, consider the implications of what we have observed. 23 civilizations are already participating in collaborative development programs that are producing technological advances at unprecedented rates. Within a few years, the collaborative network may include the majority of advanced species in the galaxy, and species that remain outside the network will find themselves increasingly isolated in a galaxy that has moved beyond traditional models of competitive interaction. Zektheri realized that he was looking at the emergence of a new form of galactic hegemony, but one unlike anything that had existed before. Instead of conquest through military superiority, the humans and their partners had created a system of integration through cooperative advantage. This is not conquest, he said, as much to himself as to his companions. No, Dr. Vasquez agreed. This is evolution. The humans demonstrated to the Draconians that cooperation could produce better results than competition. The Draconians demonstrated to other species that the human model actually worked. Now, species throughout the galaxy are discovering that collaborative development offers opportunities that none of them could achieve independently. And those who do not wish to participate are free to make that choice. But they are making it in a context where the advantages of participation become more apparent every year. As they concluded their tour of the research facilities and prepared to return to the diplomatic quarters, Zektheri found himself grappling with the implications of what he had observed. The humans had not simply won a war or prevented a conflict. They had fundamentally altered the trajectory of galactic civilization. What will you report to the Galactic Council? Admiral Korath asked as they settled in for the journey back to their respective territories. Zektheri was quiet for a long time, trying to find words that would adequately convey what he had witnessed. I will report that the humans have succeeded in accomplishing something that no species in galactic history has achieved before, which is, they have made cooperation more powerful than competition, not through force or coercion, but by demonstrating that collaborative development can produce results that surpass anything achievable through independent effort. And your recommendation regarding Nexerian participation in the collaborative network? Zektheri looked out at the stars that surrounded Nexus Station, each representing civilizations that were now faced with the choice between traditional independence and collaborative advancement. The humans had not conquered the galaxy through military superiority. They had convinced the galaxy to conquer itself through the pursuit of collective enhancement. I will recommend that we begin preliminary discussions immediately, he said finally, because I believe that the choice is not whether to participate in this new model of civilization, but whether to help shape it or simply adapt to it after others have determined its direction. As his shuttle departed from Nexus Station for the final time, Zektheri found himself thinking about the human soldiers he had observed a year ago. They had marched to war with the confidence of those who knew they could not be defeated. Now he understood why. They had not been marching to war at all. They had been marching toward the future, and they had convinced the rest of the galaxy to march with them. The humans had not simply demonstrated why the galaxy feared them when they went to war. They had demonstrated why the galaxy should hope the humans never needed to go to war again. Because when humans applied their full capabilities to cooperation instead of conflict, they transformed not just themselves, but everyone around them, creating possibilities that had never existed before and opportunities that no rational civilization could afford to ignore. The age of competitive expansion was ending. The age of collaborative evolution had begun, and the humans, once again, had shown the rest of the galaxy how to survive the transition.